2014 semester. We're doing A River Runs Through It, and today you have the privilege of hearing three of my esteemed colleagues in the English department give their perspectives on the novel. First, you're going to hear from Barbara McClure, and Barbara earned her undergraduate degree at Wichita State and her MA in creative writing at San Francisco State. She has taught English and creative writing at Wichita State, San Francisco State, City College, and Santa Rosa. Barbara is a former chair of the English department, and she now teaches full-time at SRJC in Petaluma. The focus of her talk is Presbyterian fishing, a woman's view. Barbara has been fly fishing for over 20 years, and she's going to offer a perspective on fly fishing in her talk from a female point of view, and share personal stories of what it's like to fly fish in a sport heavily dominated by men. Then Jacqueline McGhee will give her talk. She's earned her undergraduate degree in English literature at Loughborough University in England, her master's in English literature at the State University of New York at Brockport, and completed 4 years of PhD work in English literature at UC Davis. She also earned a Master's of Counseling and Psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies. Jacqueline is a faculty member in the English department on campus here. She has also worked as a psychotherapist for individuals, couples, and children. The title of Jacqueline's talk is Family Dynamics in A River Runs Through It. And Jacqueline will explore the ways that from the depths of religion and fly fishing, McLean's novel plunges us into deeper water and wilder terrain, that of the human heart. And then finally we have Carmen Castillo. Carmen was once a student here at the JC. She went on to receive her PhD in English at UC Berkeley. And now we are privileged to have her here in the English department as an instructor. The title of Carmen's talk is Poetic Impressions. And in her talk, Carmen will discuss McLean's use of poetic language. Language that Carmen says serves as a way to communicate what the plot cannot. Feelings and emotions. She suggests that poetic language can impress us in the literal and the physical sense of the word, in that they make a mark on readers. We welcome Jacqueline, Barbara, and Carmen. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Let's see if we can work this. I wanted to begin with the first line from the novel, if I can work this. In our family, there was no clear line between religion and fly fishing, and that certainly has become true in my own family. I was first introduced to fly fishing by a man who would eventually become my husband, and I kind of think it was a test of the relationship early on. He invited me to come, thank you. He invited me to come to Montana after we had been dating for about a year. I had met him in September. I knew he was a published poet. I knew he taught at Dominican College, a literature class. He's a professional tennis pro, and he teaches tennis for a living. But what I didn't know was his passion for fly fishing until I went to Montana. What happened to my view? Oh. I caught my first cutthroat trout in Yellowstone National Park. I found the beauty of Montana to be stunning. I loved being on the river. I wasn't very good at it in the beginning, although I did catch fish. But later, over the years, I discovered what it meant to be a fly fisherman and the passion that goes with that. And it was evident when my husband and I got married. He delayed our honeymoon because he had to go to Montana and fly fish first before we could go on our honeymoon. We were flying home from Montana one time, and I mentioned to him that in the time that I had moved from Kansas to the Bay Area, that I never wanted to live anywhere else. But as I was looking out the airplane window and looking at the beauty of the mountains and the streams below, I said to him, I could live here. And so that started our search for property. And this is a picture from the bench where we now own property, and we hope to build a cabin in the next couple of years. When I started fly fishing, I saw very few women on the rivers. It was primarily males, and certainly McLean acknowledged that gender role in his novel. On page 11, he writes, "She knew how to clean fish when the men forgot to, and she knew how to cook them, and most important, she knew always to peer into the fisherman's basket and exclaim, 'My, my.' So she knew all that any woman of her time knew about fishing, although it is also true that she knew absolutely nothing about fishing." Well, the times have definitely changed. When the movie adaptation of A River Runs Through It came out in '92, that summer, 60% more fly fishermen showed up in Montana. The summer after that, another 60% increase, and many of them were women. But it's still highly dominated by males. Last week I was reading the San Francisco Chronicle, and I came across an article about a man that owns a fly fishing shop in downtown San Francisco, and he made the comment, "Fly fishermen are a very good demographic, generally a six-figure income with plenty of disposable income." But as Tom Boyd remarked in the Denver Post, the mental aspects of fishing tend to level the playing field between the sexes, especially in a sport in which the gentle touch is more effective than raw strength. And we see that throughout the novel. McLean talks about the importance of the cast, that you can't overpower it. And actually, if I confess, my tendency when I cast is to overpower it. I have a beautiful backswing, but when I go forward, I tend to put too much power in it and scare the fish away. Another fly shop owner made the comment, "It's funny how often we'll have a couple out on a trip and the woman will often do better." And I asked my students about this. I said, "Why do you think women would make better fly fishermen?" And their response was patience. And I thought that that was an accurate description. Oh. Sorry. One of the first lessons I learned was that it was always to be called a rod, as McLean teaches us. I used to fish in the ponds of Kansas with my father with, worms as bait and those little white and red bobbers, and we always called it a fishing pole. But I've learned since that you never do that in the presence of a fly fishing person. When I first started reading A River Runs Through It, I started reading it when I had just come back from Montana this summer, and the first 8 pages are painfully, painfully slow. And I thought, oh my God, what have we got ourselves into? How will the students respond to this book? And then I realized, no, this is what fishing is about. It's about patience. It's about the slowness of the art. And it begins with getting ready to go fishing, getting the rods together, deciding on the flies that we're taking, and then all of the putting on of the waders. And when you get to the river, it's slow. You study the river. In fact, I've got my next picture. You read a river before you ever put a fly in. And if you watch the film, you'll see Brad Pitt throw his line in, and instantly he has a fish on. Doesn't happen like that. You work the bank, you cover a lot of water, and you can be there for several hours before you get that first fish on. This picture actually was taken in Alaska, and that's a fishing guide that I'm with. And he had me go into the river and study it before we made the first cast. McLean writes about the brown trout, the monster brown trout. These are muscular fish. They give you a great run. They usually will stay inside the water when you catch one. Also, it's important after you catch a fish, after the picture is taken, you then work with the fish and make sure it's got oxygen and before you release it back into the stream. You'll notice that in the novel and also in the film, the guys are catching the fish and killing them, keeping them. In Montana, almost all the streams now are catch and release only. He also mentions the rainbow trout. The rainbow are fun to catch. They jump out of the water. This picture was actually taken on the San Juan in New Mexico. Again, I'm with a fishing guide. And when I came across this quote on page 15, I was reminded of a story about fishing in Montana. Although I have never pretended to be a great fisherman, it was always important to me that I was a fisherman and looked like one, especially when fishing with my brother. Now, if you substitute that and say fisherwoman and fishing with my husband or fishing with Keith, this absolutely pertains to me. When I was on that first fishing trip in Montana, we'd been fishing for about 3 days, and I was starting to feel comfortable with casting the line. And it was getting to be dusk, so we were close to ending the fishing when the fishing is incredibly good. And Keith had gone down the bank a ways from me. And I was casting the line, and I caught the hook in my ear. I was really embarrassed, and I had spent much of the day untangling lines and getting help from Keith. So I didn't want to tell him because I looked down the bank, and he was steady casting and having a grand time. So I just sat on the side of the bank and watched him. And I was reminded often when reading the novel of those passages where Norman is looking at Paul and admiring the artistry of the casting, and that was true for me as well. A little while later, Keith finally collared and asked me, are you okay? And I said, yeah, keep fishing. Well, when he came back down, I had to admit to him that I had a hook in my ear. And so he had to crimp the barb and take it out. And then he said, so go ahead and cast a few more, and then we'll call it a day. I threw my line in, immediately had a fish on, and I said, I get it. Now you just put blood on the hook, and that's how you catch fish. I then thought that, okay, I have now earned the right to catch fish because I know what they feel. When I came across this quote, to women who do not fish, men who come home without their limit are failures in life, it gave me pause. And I came back and kept reading that line. And then I brought it to my class and I said, what do you think? Do you think that women really look on their men as failures if they don't catch their limit? And we all seem to agree that this is Norman McLean's perspective. It is not the women's perspective that we're looking through, which is important as you're reading the novel. And I found this quote. So many times when I was doing this presentation, practicing for it, I kept coming up with different quotes and deleting them. But this is the one that I think best captures the beauty of the cast on page 43. The cast is so soft and slow that it can be followed like an ash settling from a fireplace chimney. One of life's quiet excitements is to stand somewhat apart from yourself and watch yourself softly becoming the author of something beautiful, even if it's only floating ash. With that, I must say that having a fish on the line is a very exciting moment. I do get a thrill out of catching a fish. I did confess this summer that I didn't care if I caught a fish, that I just loved being on the river, being in the beauty. It seems to restore me. It seems to be healing. But I would be dishonest if I didn't say that I didn't like to catch the fish, this is my salmon from Alaska that I caught. And then I realized that I had these slides of me with all these men, and the one man that taught me how to fly fish and influenced my fly fishing love was not in any of the photos. So I attended the World Series game on Friday night, and someone took our picture, so that is, so thank you. And I don't know how to get out of this. Oh, we escape. Okay. Yeah.
we pull up that last screen again so that I can get to my minimized page, which is the number 2 page? Oh, thank you so much. Thanks. Where does it all go?
You just flip it on the side.
I think I'm just going to use that. Is that on? Is that on, guys?
It is.
Okay, thanks. Oh, sorry. Okay. Hi, I'm Jacqueline McGhee. I'm going to talk to you about, well, when I originally started my presentation, it was going to be family dynamics, and it kind of shifted a little bit, but I'm sure you'll bear with me. Okay, so I'm going to start by telling you a very short story about my dad. I grew up in England. My dad's Irish. And we loved to watch American films when I was a kid. So we'd watch them late into the night, as it turned out. But my dad would watch American films where it seemed as if the family members were always saying to each other, "I love you." And you know what? And I love you too, right? It seemed like that was happening a lot, like pretty much every time people spoke to each other. So we would watch this and we were baffled by it because we're, Irish and English. We didn't know that you could actually say things like that to each other. So one day we were watching a film, and 2 family members were on the phone with each other. And before they said goodbye to each other, one person said, "Okay, bye, love you." And the other person said, "Love you too," And my dad turned to me and he said, "Well, that's just ridiculous," right? Now, I want to say that my dad was a very, very loving man, very tender-hearted, a really nice guy. But the idea that you would be telling each other these kind of intimate things like this that would actually enhance a relationship was foreign to him. And it's very foreign to many Celtic people, I think. And I speak as a Celt. So by Celtic, I mean the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh, parts of Breton in France, and the McLeans. The McLeans are Celts, right? Scottish blood. And I think this, what I would call the Celtic gene, is alive and well in the novel. In that, these people, particularly the men, they don't really say things like that to each other. No matter how much they're feeling, they typically don't say it. What they often say is, "Let's go fishing," instead. Seamus Heaney, a former poet laureate from Northern Ireland, and a fine Celt himself, describes this kind of Celtic sensibility in a poem called The Docker, and he's describing this Celtic man, and he says, "Strong and blunt as a Celtic cross, clearly used to silence." So that's the rule for the McLean family, for the culture that they're living in. Silence is the rule. Be strong and silent. Don't talk about it. It's not happening. Stay silent. Keep it kind of buttoned up. We see this rule adhered to repeatedly throughout the novella. But here's just one example for you. And this is a quote from page 80. McLean says, "At times, my father would start to talk to me about Paul as if he were going to open up a new subject. And then he would suddenly put a lid on it before the subject spilled out." Can you hear that sense of containment, that sense of keeping it contained? It's very typical of the family structure in the novel. So when I was reading it, I kept noticing this. I kept noticing them trying to talk to each other and then kind of swerving away from that moment. And in the end, it seemed to me that the novel is about impossibility in some ways. The impossibility of connection when there's a barrier of silence. The unsaid that looms between us. And finally, the impossibility of saving someone who's lost in this silence. There are multiple times in the novella when characters start to break the silence between them by inquiring about the other's interior landscape, their emotional experience inside them, but only to swerve away from the interior to the exterior landscape, usually a comment about the river, or a reference to going fishing. In that way, A River Runs Through It does indeed run through it. It runs through the emotional landscape of the book, absorbing the unacknowledged and unmetabolized emotion between these people. But, so I'm reading this book, and I like emotions. I became a therapist. I love English literature. Those are my two great joys. But I like it when people are able to be relational with each other. I think it's a good idea. So when I was reading this book, I kept finding myself, I was interested in the places where the play of emotion was thwarted, where it would swerve off. And I started to get a bit desperate, because I knew I had to present on the book. And I was thinking, well, what am I going to say about it? And then I found what I consider to be the emotional heart of the book. And it's these pages here on 76 to 77. Let me minimize this a bit, if I can. Wait. Yeah, let's see if I can go down. Can you guys read that? Yes. Thank you. Matt, that was you, right? Thank you. Okay, so briefly, here's what's happening here. Well, let me first just say, it's the place where two people break the cultural rules and they put emotional material into words. It's a struggle, but they do it. They have an emotional conversation. We see them reaching out to connect and to bridge the chasm between them. And you know what? They do a great job. It really works. So today, I'm going to show you that. That's what I want to talk about. And we're going to do a little couples therapy here in Newman Auditorium. Okay. So, pages 76 to 77. Here's the scenario. Norman and Jessie, his wife, are in difficult emotional territory. Norman and Paul have brought back a badly burned, sunburned, and drunken Neil to the house. Okay, so it's the scene where they come back from the river. Jessie, Norman's wife, initially blames Norman for the state that her brother is in. She lets him know. You bastard, she says. Okay, so she's mad at him, okay? And they're well on their way to a fight. It's not an easy position, but instead, here's what happens. Instead of lapsing into silence, which is typically what happens in the book, or becoming adversarial, which is, Paul's way of doing it, get drunk and hit someone, they struggle towards a conversation, a real conversation. This is two people getting vulnerable and risking that. They're breaking all their cultural rules to do it, but they want to find their way back to each other. Okay, so let's look at what they do. Okay, so we're here on 76. I wrote down here, look, start here. These are my annotations, okay. This is straight from my book. Okay, so his wife says to him, you don't like him, do you? Which is about Neil, her brother. And McLean can't stand the guy, okay. And he says, woman, can't I love you without liking him? She just stood looking at me. So I went on talking and saying more than I had intended. That's a huge moment. He moves towards language and into speech rather than away from it. I said things she already knew, but possibly one thing she wanted to hear again. That's the I love you part. Jessie, I said, I don't know any card tricks. I don't like him, I never will, but I love you. Don't keep testing me, though, by giving me no choices. Jessie, don't let him... And then he breaks off. I stopped from going on because I knew I should have found a shorter way to say what I had already said. Can you see that the rules are there in his head? Just at the same time that he's breaking them, the internal voice is going, you're talking too much, you're saying too much, stop it, just back off, go back to silence. Jessie says, don't let him what? What were you going to say? She invites him into language. She invites him to share. I can't remember what I was going to say. He wimps out at this moment, okay? Except that I feel I have lost touch with you. That's where the scene changes. He stops talking about the content briefly, which is Neil and the drunken nurse and he's trying not to talk about the whore, as he calls her, He's trying not to say all of those things. And what he does do is go for the emotional truth of the scene, right? I feel I have lost touch with you. He's lamenting the lack of connection in that moment. I'm trying to help someone, she said. Someone in my family. Don't you understand? That's her brother. I said, I should understand. because of Paul, right? He's trying to help Paul. I'm not able to help, she says. I should understand that too, I said. So they've established some common territory here. They're both in a similar situation in terms of the family. But then she says, we're talking too long. Can you see how they're both keeping time here, right? Why don't you and Paul go back to the Blackfoot? Of course, right? Just go fishing now, right? Because that's the rule in the book. That's what you do. Finish your fishing trip. You're no help. So she goes back to the family rules here. But wherever you go, never lose touch with me. She does it too, right? She's talking about the connection. So what they're talking about is safe attachment here. They have a bond with each other, and it's the bond in their relationship, and they're both calling up the bond. Wherever you go, never lose touch with me. It's an attachment statement. Okay, so I was reading this and thinking, oh, this is really interesting. They're actually breaking out of silence and going towards emotional truth. Interesting. And then I started noticing something, which is why I wrote imp, which means important. Although she said we had talked too long, she took only one backward step. So part of her wants to obey the rules. You don't talk about this stuff. You stay quiet. So she said what she says, but she takes only one backward step. She doesn't really end the conversation. And then she says, tell me. And can you see those numbers down the side of my margin? 1, 2, 3, 4. You see the repetition there? She says it 4 times, and then at the bottom he also says it. It's a direct flouting of the rule of silence. It's a direct flouting of being strong and silent. She's inviting him over and over to do something different. Tell me, she says, why is he burnt from head to foot? Well, we know why he's burnt from head to foot. He's burnt from head to foot because he was drunk as anything and lying out and having sex with someone on the river. That's why he's burned from head to foot. But he's not going to say that to his wife about her brother. I told her what I had told her mother, and she looked like her mother while she listened. Tell me, she said. Okay, second one. Just before you brought Neil in, did you happen to see the whore run through town with an armful of clothes? She's not stupid, this woman, right? She knows what's going on, right? But she also knows that he's not telling her out of respect for her, the brother and the family relation, okay? At a distance, I told her, which was, I thought, a beautiful answer, okay? Tell me, she asked, if my brother comes back next summer, will you try to help me help him? And then look what happens. It took a long time to say it, but I said it. I said, I will try. Look at that line. Look at the repetition of said. Say, said, within what? Half a dozen words? 8, 10 words? He really wants us to notice something there because of the use of repetition. He does it. Then she said, he won't come back. Then she added, tell me, 4th time. Why is it that people who want to help do better without it? At least no worse, right? And then skip down a little, right? They take all the help they can, and they are just the same as they've always been. Okay. So that exchange between the two of them breaks all the family rules about silence. He steps into language with her. She's inviting him over and over, and they're both noticing that they're talking more than usual, that they're using more words than usual, that they're spending more time than usual. And finally we get down to this. Tell me, I asked her. He's taken his lead from her, and now he's doing it. If your brother comes back next summer, will we both try to help him? Okay. And then he talks about she doesn't cry. One step at a time, right? At least they're talking to each other about real things right here. Okay. And then look at the end. Without interrupting each other, we both said at the same time, let's never get out of touch with each other. So again, he's talking about the flow of language between the two of them without interrupting each other. And then they come upon the same statement. Let's never get out of touch with each other. And they're talking about the connection. And we never have, although her death has come between us. Her death is almost irrelevant in that statement. Can you hear that? Okay, so then I'm not going to put this next page up, but I want to tell you about it. Okay, so that's the exchange. To me, that's the emotional center of the novel. And then, of course, he goes to see Paul. They go down to Blackjack's and have a drink, and then they have another. Paul's convinced that that the marriage is breaking up because he saw the start of the fight. He heard her say, "You're a bastard." Right? He heard that. He didn't witness any of the connecting, any of the emotional reaching out. Okay. And then on halfway down 78, McLean says, "Actually, I was feeling lordly with love." Lordly, L-O-R-D-L-Y, lordly with love. And several times broke out into laughter that I can't explain. Okay. So I would argue that because he's actually connected with his wife, because they've actually had an honest emotional exchange and sought each other out and struggled through the difficulty of that, I think he's feeling this happiness and this relief and this kind of euphoria that they actually managed it, which is how you feel when you do that. You probably know that. Okay. So, so here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking about the connection between Jesse and Norman McLean and how in this one small scene, we show his ability to break through and really connect. And then it got me thinking about Paul and how he was never quite able to do that with Paul. We see him a couple of times in the novel try to do it, but they just can't quite get there, right? They have a lot of unspoken communication out on the river. They're guessing each other's thoughts a lot, but they don't put it into words very often. It's, Paul particularly swerves away from it over and over, okay? And then I thought about McLean writing the novel, right? And here's what I came up with. I think it's my belief that that McLean's novel is a love letter to his brother. I think in it, McLean swims up from the depths of his silence, and he emerges into language. He breaks the Celtic rules. He says what he couldn't quite get himself to say earlier when Paul was alive. He tells the story of his brother. Tell me, tell me. He tells it belatedly, but in doing so, he connects with his brother, and thus, as he learned with Jesse, though death has come between them, he keeps his brother with him. Beautiful. Thank you.
I think I can do it. I think I can click off here, go here. Slideshow?
It's that red one up above, the slideshow.
Red. Oh, yeah. Huh. I just wanted to get this out of the way. Do we have our techie here? Ah, thank you. I wish I had someone like that at my house because I am so bad with technology. And, okay, my name's Carmen Castillo. And before I start, I want to thank my 1A students, some of whom are in the audience, because they're the ones that helped me unpack some of the really dense poetic language that I'm going to go over, especially the one about the rabbit, the jackrabbit. So just like Jacqueline, I kind of swerved away from my original topic, which was on poetic impressions, but I kind of broadened it out to talk more about poetic language and the use of it and its function in this book, A River Runs Through It. The reason I made that switch is because the more I talked about poetic impressions, the more kind of dry and academic it got. And I decided this is already going to be hard enough to unpack this, some of the text. in just talking about poetic language. So, and because it was so difficult to talk about this, I decided to write it out, and I will be reading from my laptop. So a simple version of the plot of A River Runs Through It could be this. A man tells a story of how religion and fly fishing shaped his and his brother's life, and the family's attempt to save his brother from alcoholism and self-destructive behavior. Though the plot is simple, the artful way the events are communicated has a high level of difficulty to it. Art is difficult, as Norman's father explains in his instructions on fly fishing. He says, "Remember, it is an art that is performed on a 4-count rhythm between 10 and 2 o'clock. To him, all good things, trout, as well as eternal salvation, come by grace, and grace comes by art, and art does not come by easy." Art, in the context of this book, relates to the concept of beauty and classical notions of symmetry, balance, and harmony. The ancient Greeks also saw a strong connection between mathematics and beauty, which is echoed in the father's 4-count rhythm between 10 and 2 o'clock, as well as the 2 boys learning to fly fish to their mother's metronome. Art in this book is precise, measured, mathematical, and its difficulty has to do with the mastery of technique. Grace comes by art, according to Norman's father, and Paul and Norman use art in communicating to each other as a way to maintain the grace in their relationship. In this story, the ideas of grace and love and God are interchangeable. Norman says, quote, "Painted on one side of our Sunday school wall were the words, 'God is love.' We always assumed that these 3 words were spoken directly to the 4 of us in our family and had no reference to the world outside." End quote. Later, in describing their first and last fight the brothers have, in which they unintentionally hurt their mother, if you can remember, they're fighting, and someone throws a punch and knocks down the mother, who can't see. I guess they throw her glasses off. After this, they decide to be gracious to each other, quote, "as the wall suggested they should be," thereby conflating, which is just a fancy word of saying kind of all mixing together, conflating God, love, and graciousness. So if God is love, and graciousness is love, and grace comes by art, then the brothers' love for each other, like grace, also comes by art. Art and artifice are synonymous with each other. Art is artificial. And sometimes when I explain that to my students, it's a little bit shocking to think of art as artificial, but that is where it comes from. If you think of a ballet dancer on point and dancing and spinning around in pirouettes, that is so fake. It is so unnatural for the human body to contort itself in that way, but that is what art does. Think of the art of fly fishing and the mechanics involved in producing the imitation of a fly landing on the water. All that a rod has to do is lift the line, the leader, and the fly off the water, give them a good toss over the head, and then shoot them forward so they will land in the water without a splash. Otherwise, the fish will see the fly as a fake and be gone. In the same way that this technical artifice of fly fishing becomes art, and thereby graceful, the brothers' artfulness toward each other generates grace or love between them. The brothers' graciousness shows itself in difficult situations where language is used artfully in order to not create a splash. Painful painful conversations get cloaked in poetic language, which serves as a stabilization of grace between the brothers. Without grace as a buffer, their relationship becomes clumsy, even violent. In one situation, Paul embellishes a story about drunk driving. Now, let's see if I can do this. Yes, okay. Victory. Okay, so here's the quote. He was driving up Nevada Creek along an old dirt road that followed section lines. So section lines are these grid-like lines that are imposed on a township, and they're about a mile by a mile. So to have a road that follows the section lines is to have a road that goes straight for a while, for a mile exactly, and then turns abruptly at a right angle, and then goes another mile. Okay. It was moonlight. He was tired, feeling in need of a friend to keep him awake. This is Paul, of course. When suddenly a jackrabbit jumped onto the road and started running with the headlights. I didn't push him too hard, he said, because I didn't want to lose a friend. He drove, he said, with his head outside the window so he could feel close to the rabbit. With his head in the moonlight, his account took poetic touches. The vague world of the moonlight was pierced by the intense white triangle from the headlights. In the center of the penetrating isosceles was the jackrabbit, which, except for the length of his jump, had now become a snowshoe rabbit. The phosphorescent jackrabbit was doing his best to keep time in the center of the isosceles, but was afraid he was losing ground, and when he looked back to check, his eyes shone with the whites and blues gathered up from the universe. My brother said, I don't know how to explain what happened next, but there was a right angle turn in this section line road, and the rabbit saw it, and I didn't. In this passage, the story of the jackrabbit is made artful by the repetition of white light and of triangle images that I have put in bold letters, starting with the right angle of the section corner, which suggests a right triangle because if you remember your geometry, a right triangle has a right angle in it. Then the white triangle from the headlight. White triangle, incidentally, rhymes with right angle. So I'm just pointing out the poetics, which are a repetition that form a kind of pattern. But this white triangle is not a right angle triangle, it's an isosceles triangle. It has two equal sides, like a cone, like the light of a headlight on a road, and then the repetition of another isosceles, to the final repetition of another right angle. Quote, the right angle turn in the section line road, which the jackrabbit saw, and Paul didn't. The triangle repetition creates a geometrical metaphor that is sharp and angular, in contrast with the more vague world of the moonlight and the phosphorescent rabbit, with the eyes that shone with whites and blues gathered up from the universe. This beautiful bit of poetic expression fails to say anything about the fact that Paul was driving drunk and that he demolished his car and could have killed himself. But Norman was able to deduce it anyway. The poetic version of the story enables Paul to tell the story in a way that wouldn't create a rift. The poetic embellishment of Paul's jackrabbit story harmonizes the effects of the story in a way that maintains the balance in the prose as well as in the brothers' relationship. By balance, I mean that the prose, in the classical sense, the section opens and closes with right angles, as you can see, and nestled between are isosceles triangles. This, in the classical sense of art and beauty, is called balance. Norman, too, has his artful way of skirting around the issue of Paul's drinking, but in this next example, I want to point out the clumsiness that ensues when the art is missing. In trying to get more information out of Paul, he says, "There was still some great hollow inside me to be filled, and I needed the answer to another question. Until I asked it, I had no idea what it could be. Can I help you with money or anything?" I asked. Alarmed by hearing myself, I tried to calm down quickly. Instead of having made a mistake, I made it worse. Instead, having made a mistake, I made it worse. "I thought you might need some help because of the other night," I said. Probably he took my reference to the other night as a reference to his Indian girl. So to change the subject, I said, "I thought it might cost you a lot to fix the front end of your car the night you chased the rabbit." Now I had made 3 mistakes. He acted as if his father had offered to help him to a bowl of oatmeal. He bowed his head in silence until he was sure I wouldn't say anything more. Norman makes 3 blunders that compromise the grace between he and Paul. We learn early on that Paul never asks for help, so Norman's blunt statement, "I thought you might need some help," is in violation of an unspoken boundary of Paul's pride. Similarly, bringing up the other night indelicately brings up the fight that landed Paul in jail. And Norman's 3rd blunder was to bring up the jackrabbit story in its unvarnished version, when Paul had done such an elaborate and artful job of concealing the harsh truth of his drunk driving with his, quote, "seemingly light-hearted, slightly poetical mood, such as reporters often use in writing human interest stories," end quote. Paul's bowing his head in silence until he was sure Norman wouldn't say anything more echoes back to Paul's toughness in refusing to eat God's oats and bowing his head as if in grace as his father raged at him. Paul's bowed head here signifies the disgrace brought on by Norman's unpoetical telling of the truth. In conclusion, graciousness between brothers has to do with not disrupting the artifice that smooths over the damning effects of Paul's alcoholic behavior. And a river runs through it. Poetic language and fly fishing are the arts used to create harmony between the 2 brothers. Thank you.
What I'm most interested in, I guess, are the human relations. And so nicely, beautifully pointed out, Jesse and Norman character did at one point, as a with over the truth,
Right.
as opposed to what a lot of I don't know, psychology would call evading the truth.
So
But you call Carmen. Castillo, the
artifice.
artifice
Mhm.
of keeping harmony
Yeah.
in the relationship
And keeping grace.
and
Yeah.
grace and harmony in the relationship, and I'm really torn.
Okay, can I help you just
Thank you.
say it for the mic? Okay, so was your question something like the book brings up different ways to handle having a relationship with someone who perhaps has an addiction or has a serious problem like that? And when does the book suggest, or does real life suggest when we should go forward with trying to tell the truth, or maybe confront or call somebody on something, and when to back off and maybe retreat into some kind of artifice or not be confrontational? Was that your question?
Well, right, and when you rephrase it so nicely for me, I'm beginning to think that one reason I've always loved this book, for decades I've loved this book,
Oh.
is because it does, I think, suggest, contrary to whatever that phrase is that is escaping me, that the better thing in life, the wiser thing in life, is often to preserve the harmony and the grace, and not be confrontational and truthful and say it the worst possible way, like the damage, all the damage to the front end of your car that you did, and because you were so flat out drunk. And so I think maybe I always thought I loved it because of the recognition that you can't really help someone else
Who's-
as much as
yeah.
you want. It's not, and poetic, I love writing, but I think also maybe that is an insight to me.
It sounds like you've just had a major epiphany about the book after having loved it for decades, apparently. So I'm really glad that happened. I see it differently. I see, for example, the scene between Jesse and Norman as an example of what we can do if both people are willing to have the conversation. And that's the difference. Paul's not, right? Paul's not willing because he's enmeshed in his problems. So, but Jesse and Norman struggle towards each other in that scene. And I think that he gets to keep her even when she's dead because of that. The connection's still strong in his heart. Whereas with Paul, he's having to manipulate it even now to some extent. Yeah.
With Paul, it seems with Paul and Norman's interaction, even though he knows that he's the alcoholic and radical, he feels more codependent like.
Yeah.
So it seems like
So this gentleman's observation was that Norman's interaction with Paul has a stronger flavor of codependency than it does with his wife, for example. It's a very different, because she's not organized around a problem, right? And but Norman's caught between coing him, basically being codependent with him, and loving him and trying to get him to face the truth sometimes, and he's fumbling around, But yeah. And of course the Celtic code of silence and strong inadvertently helps the codependency, I think, because it suggests that you would not call somebody on it directly. Yeah. That you would, in fact, Carmen, right, make a beautiful story of it, right? And that you would become complicit in the story. And in fact, if you stepped outside of the story, that you would have blundered. Yeah. But I think I have to come back to the fact that in the end, MacLean wrote the novel or the novella and told the truth about his brother, I like to believe, told it like it is. Told it, yes, he was drunk in the car. I think he was drunk in the car. I think he smashed the car up drunk. And also tells Paul's story on top of that, and his own sense of blunder, and allows the reader to do what you did, which was to find our way through it and to find the meaning we need in the moment. It's a very generous novel, I think.
He does, even at the end with his death.
Yeah.
The Norman character
Mm-hmm.
lets us, the readers, know pretty much how his brother dies, but he also lets the father think
Yeah.
the kinder thing that, well,
Yeah.
maybe it was a stick up and he was just defending himself rather than,
Right.
you know, it was a result of his own bad behavior, like
Right.
family debts or something.
Right. So for you, that's like
Or a bar fight.
it sounds like it's a final. So if you didn't hear, this lady was talking about the way that Norman talks with his father about Paul's death, the things he chooses to tell Paul's father or their father, and the things that he chooses not to tell. And it sounds like for you, McLean's way of handling that was kind of like his final gift to his father about Paul. He shielded his father from possibly brutal details. But he lets us know, yeah. It's very sophisticated the way he does that, right? Yeah. Did you have a question?
The scene you talked about, the conversation with Norman and Jesse.
Yeah.
I was curious, did you have conversations like that with your own father?
Oh, since you've asked, so the question was the conversation between Jesse and Norman. This young man asked, did I have conversations like that with my own father? So since you asked, I'm going to tell you something, that when I was 26 and living in California, I decided it was time to tell my father that I loved him. So I called him up one day and did that. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful. Yeah, it was wonderful. And his answer was, I love you too, sweetheart. And from then on, we were able to say things like that. So God bless Northern California, is what I say, because it's the environment that helps you do that. So thanks for asking. Did you have questions I don't have to stand at the mic. Okay, looks like we might be done then. Okay, thanks for coming, everybody.